Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our panel discussion on offshore wind energy. I'm Tristan Bowrick. I'm a reporter with the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. And we published a 5-part series last week about offshore wind energy and its potential in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as some of the challenges that we might face as offshore wind is developed around here in Louisiana. And a few of the experts that we talked to for this series are here with us this morning. So today we have State Representative Joe Orgeron. He is the co-founder of Second Wind Marine, which designs vessels specifically for building and servicing offshore wind farms. We also have Sara Ghazizadeh, and she is a renewable energies manager for Keystone Engineering, which is based in Mandeville. And both Joe and Sara have had experience helping to build the first offshore wind farm, which was in Rhode Island in 2016. And we also have Annie Hawkins. She's the executive director of Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, which advocates for the fishing industry. And she's been very involved with some of the issues surrounding wind farms on the East Coast, as well as in the Gulf. So just to jump right in, let's start with Joe. Joe, can you tell us a bit about how you first got involved in the offshore wind industry? Joe, looks like you're muted. Looks like I can't hear you, Joe. Can anybody hear Joe?
I'm sorry, Joe. Your mic is not working. You're not muted. It's something to do with your connection.
Maybe we'll swing back to Joe. We'll move over to Sara, and it basically kind of the same question I had for Joe. You've been involved in several offshore wind projects. Tell us about the Block Island project and what being involved in that was like, and kind of what it meant for your company.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us today. It's a pleasure being here. As you already noted in your articles, Keystone Engineering has been involved in the offshore wind industry in the U.S. for over 15 years. Our first involvement was Cape Wind project, which unfortunately didn't go through. But after that, we got the Block Island project and 2 other Department of Energy funded projects, Fishermen's Energy and BowTap. So that's how Block Island Wind Farm was developed by this small company called Deepwater Wind, which was later acquired by Ørsted, the Danish EPC for offshore wind farm. But our involvement was basically designing the foundations and substructure, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is very conventional oil and gas looking jacket, 4-legged jackets. I supported the engineering of that project, and we were able to maximize the U.S. supply chain for that project because of our relationships with fabrication yards and other shipyards in the Gulf area. It was successfully installed in 2016, and we just celebrated the 5th anniversary of that wind farm.
And when I talked to you last, you mentioned that there's been a lot of growth within your company, like several engineers now are devoted entirely to offshore wind.
Yeah, so since start of this year and the new administration, there has been a huge push for offshore wind, 30 gigawatt by 2030. So we see a lot of need in engineering and design and support, and also providing feedback to developers who are new to this market. So there has been a lot of requests, and we are trying to build back the team and continue being one of the pioneering companies in the U.S. Offshore wind market.
Great. Do we have Joe? Joe, are you there? Looks like he still is not able to talk to us. I see he's talking, but we'll try some other way. Let's go to Annie. Kind of sticking to the East Coast. The Block Island project was relatively small, and there were not immense impacts on the fishing industry, but there were still some impacts. Can you talk a bit about some of the impacts that project has had, and then also, kind of the bigger picture of some of the projects that have been proposed around it, much larger ones off the coast of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, that sort of thing?
Sure. And you can hear me okay, right?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. So the Block Island project, like you said, is much smaller than the ones we're looking at now on these on the federal waters scale here. What was really interesting about the Block Island project is that it went through a really robust planning process from the state of Rhode Island. They developed a program they call the Ocean SAMP, which is a special area management program, and went through years and years of rounds of meeting with different ocean users and looking at sensitive habitats, various fish stocks in the area, as well as, obviously all the stuff from the energy side, and went through this sort of siting and planning process for these 5 turbines that are, again, relatively small and in a line, as opposed to the grid shape that we're really seeing coming through now more on the federal ones. We see that part of the reason the project was successful and got built was because of that upfront deconflicting. The area that the project is in is close to shore. It's in state waters. It was not home to a lot of commercial fishing before the project was built because of that deconflicting process, as we say. And we have seen certainly a lot of recreational fishing activity around the Block Island wind farm, and we've seen it pretty much avoided by commercial fishermen, but that's not necessarily a huge change. There were some fishing trips around there before, and they're mostly avoiding it just because of the location and the sensitivity of the area. So on the federal waters projects now that we see in that same region as Block Island, there's actually a 1,400 square mile cluster of leases. I believe it's 5 or 6 different leases that could have maybe 14 or so projects within them. It's about 30 miles offshore. So very, very different ecosystem, different area where you have a lot of turbines closer together. And now we're looking at a minimum of probably 12 megawatt turbines in that area, just sort of much bigger and more extensive. And the federal waters projects are now planned on areas that are hosting a lot of commercial fishing activity, particularly in the squid fishery, lobster fishery, as well as a lot of other fisheries that transit through that area to get to their fishing grounds from port. And so now we're starting to see a lot more of these conflicts, a lot more complaints, a lot more concern about the process overall.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues I heard from fishermen about the Block Island project was the transmission line that runs on the seafloor, and that they were catching their nets on it a lot. Is that an issue that has been resolved in later wind projects where they've been able to drill deeper or bury that line better?
Yeah, unfortunately, not to our knowledge. I mean, there's a little bit of, we'll see when it happens, right? Because they're not built yet. And so I can't say that there's actual realized conflicts at this point, but there is a lot of concern from the fishing community about those cables that did become exposed at Block Island, as well as reports last summer about a lot of cables, European projects that have become exposed. And interestingly, we've talked a lot with some of the UK fishing groups and the European groups that have more experience operating in and around the wind projects over there. And what they tell us pretty consistently is, stop worrying about the turbines. It's the cables that are going to take up most of the real estate and that are going to cause the real conflicts with fishing. Not that the turbines don't, but just in terms of sort of the overall area that they take. And so I know there have been a lot of concerns with that. The In terms of the burial depth, the fishing industry has pretty consistently asked for at least 8 feet in depth, and it does depend which fisheries are operating near there. Obviously, with trap and pot fisheries, you probably don't need as much wiggle room from where the cable is. But if you look at trawl dredge fisheries that do contact the bottom to varying degrees, obviously there's a lot of concern there if they were to hit a cable or if the cable were to become exposed. We have a lot of fisheries on the East Coast that, like the clam fishery, that operates on a high energy sandy bottom. So that obviously that bottom shifts a lot, which creates a lot more risk for exposure. And as well as clam fishing, it operates with dredges that do contact the bottom. And so in areas like that, you start to think about the need for much greater burial depth. There aren't specific federal regulations about how deep the cables have to go. It's something that the developers, assess the area. They propose to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management how deep they believe they can keep the cable buried. And then that goes through an engineering review, but it's not something that's really been deconflicted with fisheries yet at all.
Gotcha. It looks like Joe has popped back on the screen. Can we hear you, Joe?
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I had to completely reboot. So at least everybody knows that this is live, and that's what happens with.
We're not
live.
faking it at all. It's
Yeah,
real.
not at all. Not at all. You
So
want me to
Joe,
field the original question?
Wanted to go back to you, Joe, and just get you to kind of talk about how you got involved in the offshore wind industry.
Working in the family business of lift boats, primarily working in decommissioning and oil and gas. It looked to be a dead end, and eventually we'll be taking out enough platforms. So look for something else to use the assets. Actually brought a lift boat up to the East Coast to do a scientific coring project for some European scientists, a European consortium. And while up there, got 3 calls from 3 different offshore wind agencies looking to also begin their geotechnical work for the upcoming wind farms that were going up. And ultimately, Block Island, or Deepwater Wind, picked up the vessel before we headed back to the Gulf. And we actually went do the geotechnical cores where the current foundations reside.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got into it. And knowing that if 3 calls from 3 different organizations look at my lift boats and saying that they could use them, I figured it was something I should keep an eye on. And then I just started going to every offshore wind conference. At least one or two a year to stay in tune with what was going on. And that ultimately ended up putting me in place to work on the foundations, and then subsequently do the feedering of the blades and the tower segments for Block Island.
And for people that don't know about feedering, what is that?
Because of the Jones Act, merchandise moved from a U.S. port to an offshore facility like the Jacket Foundation needs to be transported by a U.S. flagged vessel, U.S. crewed, U.S. owned. And therefore, for the Block Island contract, they had contracted with an installation company by the name of Fred Olsen, a Norwegian company. And that vessel basically stayed offshore in the field, and we basically used our lift boats, as in this picture, to basically transport or feed the installation vessel and bring the components to get installed offshore to actually to assemble the offshore wind turbine.
Great. Well, and let's kind of get into the Gulf of Mexico angle, and we'll just stick with you, Joe, on that. What do you think are, I guess, some of the opportunities or challenges of developing offshore wind, both, the structures and the facilities, but also the industrial backbone of it?
Well, some of them play into one another, and that is, the 3 things I always talk about are the hurricanes, which we've recently had our fill of, the softer soil bottoms, and lastly, the overall lower cost of energy along the Gulf Coast that we pay for as compared to the East Coast. So The East Coast, where they're currently building offshore wind turbines, has a continental shelf, which makes it great for fixed bottom structures, as we do in the Gulf of Mexico. But with all the alluvial depositions and river depositions, the soils are a lot softer. And so possibly more of the foundation jackets will be built, which is great for Louisiana, because we have a lot of that innate labor knowledge from all the offshore oil and gas platforms that were built. Hurricanes, there's Asia Pacific is a burgeoning market as well, and they have less strong winds in Malaysia and Taiwan and Vietnam, just as we do in the Gulf, as compared to the North Sea and the East Coast. And therefore, looking at these new built offshore wind turbines that are typhoon classed or have better hurricane resiliency is a good fit for the Gulf of Mexico market. And as far as the cheaper energy that we, with all the hydrocarbon production in the Gulf and around South Texas and shale plays, we have just a cheaper energy source already existent. And as we move forward, the potential of maybe using the Gulf of Mexico offshore wind to produce green hydrogen, which could be a dense energy fuel of the future, a low carbon or no carbon energy fuel of the future. Maybe utilizing some of the pipeline the pre-existing pipeline infrastructure is something that holds promise. So that's what I see for the Gulf of Mexico. And just very also pleased, as being a state representative, to also be the person that's on the BOEM Intergovernmental Task Force looking at opening up the Gulf Coast OCS, or Outer Continental Shelf, to offshore wind leases, with hopefully the first Gulf of Mexico wind lease sale occurring a year from now in December of 2022, if all goes proper.
Great. And Sarah, kind of the same question for you. I mean, what do you see as some of the opportunities just within the Gulf of Mexico region for offshore wind?
Well, I have to pretty much reiterate everything that Joe said. Those are the main challenges, alongside lower wind speed compared to the East Coast. But that being said, from the technical standpoint, these are not the challenges that we cannot overcome. From the foundation and substructure designer standpoint, we have a proven track record of platforms withstanding hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. The design for the offshore wind turbines is definitely more challenging and more complex due to the different nature of cyclic loading and dynamic loading that the turbines impose on the foundations and substructures. But as also Joe mentioned, in Asia Pacific, there are a lot of research and development happening at this time, and even for the projects up in the Northeast, we're still required to do the design for hurricanes. So designing for hurricanes is not a new thing, and that's been already in the design process for the substructures. As far as lower wind speed compared to East and West Coast, to my understanding, there are a lot of innovations that are happening with turbines, with the blades that can harness even lower wind speeds and can be extremely efficient. So pretty much the industry is moving towards getting more and more efficient. And even if you look at Block Island Wind Farm, which was just 5 years ago, the turbines were 6 megawatt. And now we are looking at next generation of turbines, up to like 18 megawatts. The commercial one is 13 or 14 megawatt by GE. So the industry is moving extremely fast. And the challenges of hurricanes, softer soil, that's great for our industry. We can, it may be challenging to use monopiles in the Gulf. But jackets, our fabricators are extremely experienced. Our design engineers are very experienced with this type of design. There are small differences that we would need to, for example, design pre-pile jackets, most likely for an offshore wind farm instead of post-piled. But that's not, again, a challenge that would pretty much prevent us from advancing the offshore wind farm in the Gulf area, in my opinion.
And for some people that may not know about some of those design elements, the monopile is just like one simple post.
It's one single extremely large pile, which is a huge pipe basically that is driven into the seabed. And when we say jacket, it's more of anything that piles are driven through the sleeves. And it's usually three-legged or four-legged. For offshore oil and gas, you see 6, 8, 12. But the most common designs for offshore wind is either 3 or 4. And the piles would be driven first, and then the jacket would be dropped over. And that's due to installation sequencing, because for an average size wind farm, you would have about 70 to 80 foundations. So that's more efficient in terms of installation sequencing.
Great. And Annie, also on the issue of the Gulf of Mexico, I know you've been talking to people in our shrimp industry, and can you tell us a bit about the concerns they have about offshore wind in the Gulf?
Sure. So, and I think you did a really nice job of covering a lot of them in your article for those that have seen it. But big part of the problem here is that the places that we have that are most suitable for offshore wind in the Gulf are the places that are also most heavily utilized by the shrimp fishery. And so I think there's other fisheries that will have conflicts, but that's really the one that seems to be rising to the top in terms of how we're going to look at this in terms of, sharing space or allowing access for the shrimp fishery to continue producing seafood, right? So there's a sort of an opportunity here, if we can frame it that way, which is that, in the Gulf, the fishermen have a lot more experience working with this federal agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, because of the history of oil and gas, and we really don't see that on the East and West Coast so much. And so the question is really arising, how is this going to work, right? How are these guys going to be involved in the process, in the siting process? How are we going to identify areas that are really important to shrimping so that we're not displacing, obviously, that really important activity? But there's also a place where the parallels with oil and gas end, right? So we have all that history, but we're talking about a much, much bigger footprint here. And I think there's a myth floating around that it's perfectly easy just to go fish between the turbines, and as long as you don't get too close to them, there's not going to be an issue, right? These guys go pretty close to oil and gas platforms. Why can't they just do the same with turbines? But when you're looking at the conversion of the entire ocean space that goes into creating a wind project, and when you're looking at particularly grid patterns or random patterns of turbines, it's not so easy to navigate around and through as when you just have one fixed structure or a fixed structure of a pipeline, right? And so there's a lot of reasons that this is heavily going to impact fishing. And given the impetus behind offshore wind right now, the resources going behind it, the motivation, huge motivation to move quickly on a new solution to climate change, we are really behind the curve on getting the fishermen at the table, on figuring out what their spatial requirements are, what the operational requirements of those vessels are, and also looking at the shoreside components, right? Because offshore wind is not just turbines and cables in the water, it's also upgrading shoreside transmission so that you can plug in the electricity. It is a huge amount of induced vessel traffic, particularly in the construction and decommissioning phases. And there's just so many questions on the table here about how we can look at this in these areas that are so extremely valuable for seafood production and for local economies from the shrimp fishery, so that we can get ahead of that curve as much as possible.
Great. Well, I want to jump into some of the questions because we have several, and these questions came from people who've read our story, so they've kind of gotten the basics and they want a little more information. So we have the first question we have is from Troy of Raceland, and he asks, how do they route the power cables to land? How safe is this procedure underwater and with all the pipelines and boat traffic in the water? Joe or Sarah want to take that one, or?
I'll take a shot. I would imagine, you got to have a full meter or 3 feet, 5 feet of cover. Normally dredging. Well, first of all, there's 2 types of cables. There's the inner array cables, which are basically from each turbine that sometimes are daisy chained to multiple turbines that go to an offshore substation where power can be converted. And then you have and that's in the field. And then you generally have 2 large export cables, generally about, a foot in diameter, each one of them. And those are generally buried or dredged, laid, and covered for their landing spots or crossing to the beach, or horizontally bored under beaches and roads to interconnect with substations. So I don't know if that answers the question, but similar to pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico, basically a dredge, making a trench and dropping them in a trench and burying them over.
Do you see much conflict with the existing pipelines running those kind of cables through?
We got so many pipelines. We got to get right of ways and crossings. It's been done in the Gulf for 50, 60 years. It's just where are you planning on landing it will probably be somewhere where there's a need for power. And that'll probably be the most, as it is in the East Coast, it's usually a very contentious area, a beach, a bird sanctuary, a protected estuary area or something like that you're trying to get that into. So the permitting and the siting and permitting is always one of the biggest delays and problems.
Great.
And
Sarah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and just add to what Joe already mentioned. I'm not a cabling expert, but the cable routing and monitoring the seabed and scanning the seabed for any obstacle, whether it's a pipeline, whether it's a UXO, those are part of the very early stages of developing an offshore wind farm. So all of those will be done in a very timely manner to make sure that the cable routing and the arrangement and locating the offshore wind turbines are all taken into consideration. And as also Joe mentioned, depending on the soil, the cables will be buried, and the cables will be filled up with something we call like scour protection, so that they will pretty much stay in place and wouldn't move due to any sand wave movement or any other dredging or any other impact that may happen to the cables. So that's an actual science, and there are very specific companies who do those type of studies and incorporate them in the development of offshore wind farms.
Great. And Janelle O'Halloran of Baton Rouge is asking the question everybody wants to know: how will hurricanes in the Gulf affect the building there? So, and Sarah, you talked a little bit about that already, but can you talk about, I guess, some of the potential designs that could be used? I mean, I've heard of, floating turbines and other ideas. What can you tell people to kind of alleviate that fear of hurricanes knocking everything down after they're built?
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, floating and having floating foundations that can be floating substructures that can be towed back to shore to safety before a hurricane event. That's something that's being done. currently, but even for fixed structures, there are design criteria that we look at when we design any foundation. So we basically look at different extreme wind events that can happen, and we simulate the loads, and we, based on the wind speeds, based on the historical data that we have, we apply those loads to our model, which is pretty a detailed model of the substructure, and we look at the behavior of the structure under those simulated loadings. So those are all different load cases under international standards that pretty much define all different scenarios for those extreme wind events. And this is a collaboration with the turbine manufacturer. So we sit down with the turbine manufacturer and we look at the worst case scenario for both their turbines, their towers, and also the substructure that we're designing. So that's pretty much something that's being done. And we're just, if anything, we're just improving our designs. We're optimizing our design to withstand hurricane and also be economically feasible. In terms of installation, that's a very good point that, yeah, of course, we can't really install our substructures during hurricane season. But that's always the case. The installation contractor looks at the weather data and come up with an installation window that would be the safest for pile driving, for loading the jackets or the substructures and installing the substructure, tower, and turbine. So those are all the considerations that go into the design and installation of offshore wind turbines, and they're currently happening. So yeah.
Great. Somebody from New Orleans asked the question, are there negatives with wind power offshore? Are the birds and fish safe? So we don't have a bird expert on the panel, but we talked to people for the story about that. The Audubon, Louisiana, obviously there's going to be impacts with birds, but the folks that we talked to said overall they felt that the reduction in emissions from fossil fuels was going to make it, improve things for birds and, kind of offset the impacts overall. But maybe Annie, you could address the issue with fish and maybe fish safety. Have you heard of concerns about just the impact beyond the fishermen, but the fish themselves?
Sure. Yeah, so we look into that a lot, obviously. And honestly, the answer is it depends what fish you're talking about. I think you are looking at converting the seabed into something that it wasn't before, right? And that's always going to favor some species and it's going to disfavor others. We do know that oil and gas platforms and other structures in the water can serve as artificial reefs, we call them, right? So you can increase the concentration, at least, of certain species around these areas, but that of course has ecosystem level effects. There's a wide open question, depending on the exact location and the exact species you're looking at, whether you're simply aggregating species or whether you're actually increasing their productivity and abundance. I think there's a lot of misconception about that people think that because you create these so-called fish havens, that's increasing the fish stock. It may or may not be. There's cases where it has, but there's certainly a lot of cases where research has shown that it's simply concentrating the stocks, but that could actually have negative consequences across their regular range. And there's going to be winners and losers. They can be susceptible to invasive species coming in, which sometimes do favor hard substrates and these types of things. The answer to that question is going to look very different in whatever specific region and specific site we're talking about. And so you really need to look at what was there before, what's going on in the food web and in the ecosystem, what's likely to be attracted to, EMF from the cables or heat from the cables or the structure of the turbines themselves or the materials Sarah was talking about for scour protection and mattressing. And if the goal is to increase the aggregation or the abundance of certain stocks, you have to actually design the project with that in mind, right? It matters what materials you use. It matters if and where and how deep the cable's buried, all of these things. And, unfortunately, we haven't seen that happen anywhere. On the ecological research side, we're pretty stuck at monitoring, right? So the projects off of New England, the projects on the West Coast are looking at kind of baseline monitoring where they collect a couple of years of baseline data and then they go count fish and, they drop cameras and say, okay, well, what's happening now? That's not the same as regular science, right? Where you're generating a hypothesis and then testing it and then trying to adapt and build to get desired outcomes. And so, yes, it'll change the ecosystem. What the winners and losers of that are going to be is going to be highly dependent on a lot of small decisions along the way.
Great. We have a question from Robert Edwards of Covington. He wants to know, have local government agencies offered to retrain fishermen to use newer, better suited techniques that allow easier fishing near wind towers? Also, could fishermen make a good living as fishing guides and or tourist guides? You want to take that one too, Annie?
Yep, I can take that. So no, I haven't seen too many incentive programs. It is something that in some fisheries, they're asking for increased funding to look at gear modifications that could potentially look at adaptive fishing methods to fish within wind projects. We do know that from Europe, there is no mobile gear fishing operating in wind energy areas at all, right? It's just deemed too unsafe, too many risks. In some places, it's outright illegal to do that. And in some places like the UK, the fishermen just aren't doing it, both because of the changes in the fish stocks and the catchability of the fish, as well as obviously the safety issues. There are some fisheries that are more suitable to gear modification than others. There's some that's just not really a viable option for those fisheries, but there's some that certainly would be worth looking into. I do know that, there's a project funded by Equinor, I believe, in Scotland at the first floating offshore wind project to look at sort of fishing feasibility trials. It's a really tiny pilot project right now that I think they're planning on expanding next year. Most fishermen, if you talk to them, will say this is not, if we could fish a different way and it'd be more efficient, we'd be doing that already, right? These guys are pretty savvy and pretty adaptable. And so looking at it after the fact to kind of backfill how to get them back in there and catch a lot less than they used to is not really something that most people are striving for, right?
This next one is, did you want to say something, Joe?
Yeah, you were talking about state agencies, and there is an existing fund for gear replacement for commercial fishermen in the Louisiana or in the Gulf Coast, where primarily midstream companies, pipeline companies that operate in the Gulf pay initially a fee and then an annual fee that's based on the how much is in the, I'm going to call it the pot, so that whenever trawlers get nets ripped up or lose gear, they could apply for a refund to a replacement cost. And there's probably going to be upcoming legislation to change the mechanism of the funding of this. They haven't yet brought in offshore wind into the equation. It's just to make the fund more consistent rather than having a fluctuation in how much money's in the pot as it has been in the last few years. But with offshore wind and lease sales coming in, bringing in gear that might be lost in offshore wind farms in the Gulf of Mexico is something that could be actually added into that legislation if you want to be prospective looking forward. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah, if I can interest in add to that. So, and there is also, of course, the federal fund for gear replacement and direct losses from oil and gas, but that's also not been expanded to include offshore wind, and that would require national legislation. So what we are seeing, particularly off of New England and the Mid-Atlantic now, are in fact a lot of cases of gear interactions and gear loss, even without having the federal projects in place yet, but from the surveys, from the research activities that the offshore wind companies are doing. And right now, all of those claims are administered by the developer and adjudicated by the developer. And that is certainly something that we want to look to the experience in the Gulf with oil and gas nationally to figure out how to get a national program in place so that that's neutrally adjudicated, because there are a lot of problems with the way they're going now.
Great. Next question. This one's a very specific one, might be one for Joe. What is the daily cost of an elevating boat or other vessel to perform maintenance on the generator or blades of the wind power generator system.
Gotcha. So basically, they're looking at the vessels that actually could get all the way up to the what we call hub height, and those are they're going to be in, I'm going to say $100,000 a day. The basically the installation vessels that operate can be anywhere in the $200,000 to $500,000 a day range if you're installing. And they're the ones that are basically jackups. They could elevate, get out of the seas, have a stable work platform with a crane that's high enough to reach up to hub height. You're basically looking at a 100 million to 500 million, depending on whether or not it's dedicated just for O&M operations and maintenance, repair, or if it's a full-fledged installation vessel meant to go into port, load up multiple turbine sets and go back out. You're looking at a 100 million to 500 million dollar asset there. And generally the old adage of $1,000 a day rate per $1 million of construction costs is still holds today. And so I'm going to say, it could be from $100,000 to $500,000 a day, depending on what's your goal there. It's very expensive.
Yeah, for sure. Next question is from Stephen of New Orleans. He asks, how much pushback from the state legislature because of the history of the oil and gas industry in Louisiana? Joe, you're in the legislature. You want to take that one?
I am. I mean, and there very little. I think we've all kind of adopted an all of the above energy policy. In the last administration moving forward, basically going from energy dependent through energy independent and barely moving through energy dominance with exports. We knew that an all of the above solution is where we needed to be. I mean, there's a few people, every once in a while, I get something that, I get called maybe a turncoat or something for embracing offshore wind in some way, shape, or form. But, I'm looking at it from the service industry of whether or not it's hydrocarbons being pulled up from beneath the soil or harnessing the sparser energy from wind offshore. It's still offshore jobs that require a safety mantra, 365, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week type of working offshore, basically innate skill set. And so to me, it's immaterial, or it's turning to be immaterial on whether or not you're working in oil or gas or offshore wind. It's basically your offshore energy production. So, but in the legislature, we haven't had much pushback.
Annie, you want to say something?
Yeah, it's really interesting because this is probably the question that I get most frequently, right? For when I'm at panels and in the public is this divide between oil and gas and offshore wind. And honestly, my group, we constantly get accused. I get a couple emails a week saying, "Oh, you guys must be funded by the oil and gas industry to shut down renewables." And I think there's a really interesting misperception here because the offshore wind developers are either oil and gas companies or they're multinational energy companies that used to be oil and gas companies or that took the staff from oil and gas companies. It's actually in a lot of ways the same industry, right? In most ways, it's the same industry. There's no offshore wind developer or prime company working in offshore wind that qualifies as a small business under the U.S. Small Business Administration, right? This is, like Joe said, offshore energy is offshore energy. And so I think that's so important to keep in mind in terms of when we're looking at not just regulation, but what the other interests are. Where I've seen oil and gas and offshore wind diverge, if they diverge, is the question of whether these will actually be U.S. jobs, right? What can we do with offshore wind to make sure that our existing previous oil and gas industry can make that transition, like Joe's doing very effectively to offshore wind? But that's kind of the big question. It's not a political either or in any way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Greenpeace and Sierra Club don't have the pockets to build offshore wind farms, but Shell and Ørsted and Equinor does. So you got to embrace the all the energy companies to get this done.
Great. So Mike of New Orleans asks, what is the delta between the carbon footprint of maintaining a saltwater wind farm versus the actual carbon saved via wind? So I think the question is kind of, what's the balance? Does it strike the balance in the end? And is it better than carbon? Sarah, you want to try that one?
That's an interesting question. I really do not have a number in my head, but I know that, for example, for Black Island Wind Farm, we had about 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide offset. So that's just, and that just 5 turbines, which, powered about 16 or 17,000 homes. They were able to bring up that 40,000 tons of offset. So I'm probably biased. So I think at the end of the day, we have a greater carbon dioxide offset, but I do not have the number to compare.
Another question we have, Alan Drake of New Orleans wants to know, are the winds offshore Louisiana strong enough to be commercially attractive?
You had
Joey?
you had the great what we call the heat map that basically showed in the Gulf of Mexico, basically the best winds are from Brownsville to Corpus Christi, and then they drop off as you get towards Cameron and drop further across Louisiana. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying the further you go west and down the Texas coast, the more persistent, consistent the winds are. And I would see for commercial viability, I would see the first OCS project probably wanting to get bids or put in bids for lease sales in that area to be more profitable. There are prototype projects that I've heard of that want to use that want to do it within Louisiana state waters. And even those are tucked all the way to the western border, to the Texas-Louisiana border. So,
yeah, and I get that sense too. I mean, when the companies express their interest in developing offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico, they did focus their attention on Texas. But even if the first developments do happen in Texas, do you think that Louisiana companies can benefit from that?
absolutely. With our large base in the offshore oil and gas service industry, we're bound to benefit from all activities up and down the regional Gulf Coast. And having personal experience of going do a job up on the East Coast where there was a lot of I'm going to call it state-specific constraints on where I purchased groceries and fuel from. I can tell you that even though the state legislators who crafted the deal up on the East Coast probably looked at it as we're doing the right thing for our state, it actually, I think it has a detriment for the overall offshore wind industry. So even though I'm representing the state of Louisiana and the businesses that are in Louisiana, I'm going to try to move the Gulf of Mexico offshore wind industry as a regional entity and try to avoid any compartmentalization of this has to be done with Louisiana talent or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Colin Ash of New Orleans asks, what is the advantage to offshore wind projects versus onshore wind farms? Is it that much better that a state like Texas, where the greatest Gulf wind potential is, would prioritize offshore wind projects instead of just doing more on land? So maybe Sarah or Joe want to take a stab at that one?
Sarah, you go first. I have an idea.
Sure. So the main big difference is you have higher and more steady winds when you go offshore. And to just things in perspective, for onshore wind, the most common size of turbine that you see is about 2 megawatt. Although I've seen 4.5 megawatts recently, but they're very rare. And as a matter of fact, they are in Texas. So that's a very valid question. And there should be some feasibility and, financial comparison of, both onshore and offshore. But the very important advantage of going offshore, as I mentioned, is higher winds and more steady winds. So that means higher efficiency of the wind turbines and higher electricity generation, or more steady electricity generation that you may not necessarily get with onshore. But that's something that need to be looked at. Onshore is definitely less challenging, but offshore, when you compare 2 megawatt to, as I said, 14 megawatt, that's currently commercial size for offshore. That's it's not just a factor of 7. The actual electricity that's generated is even a higher factor. So.
Yeah, I was going to
Joe,
just
you
say,
want
size and proximity, and she covered the size with the size of the turbines. And in the aircraft industry, we used to have lots of 707 jet airliners with 4 engines, and then eventually they went to 3, and now all the primarily jets have 2 larger engines to do the same work. And in the offshore wind industry, the same thing is true, that they'll get a power purchase agreement to generate a certain amount of electricity. And Block Island is a perfect case. Block Island actually started 30 megawatts, and that was going to be 6 5-megawatt turbines. And GE was able to do some finagling inside their turbines to make it be 6. So they basically honored their 30 megawatt by dropping one of the 6 down to 5 turbines. And that basically helps with the total cost of ownership and maintenance. So in Vineyard Wind, which is the next large utility grade scale project going up off of Massachusetts, was, whenever I was working on it, they were looking at, I think it was 87 turbines of a 9.5 size. And now that they had a pause with BOEM permitting, and they've actually to make that same amount of energy, they've opted to go with a much larger turbine, a 14 or 13 megawatt GE turbine or whatever it is. So now they're in the 60s to generate the same amount of power, which overall makes it easier to maintain and service fewer number of turbines. And that only happens offshore, because onshore you have the limitations of roads and tunnels and places where you need to, base infrastructure, street infrastructure, where you need to get them out to location, and you don't have that offshore.
Yeah, and I had a question about that, and this would be a question I would have for Annie about the growing size of the turbines. Is that a positive for fishermen, just that potentially we're going to have farms with fewer turbines and just larger ones?
Yeah, we really don't have an answer to that question yet, because we haven't seen that, and honestly, it's never been asked in a meaningful way. So once a larger, more efficient turbine comes on the market, that's the turbine people are going to use, right? They actually discontinue for offshore. They discontinue the old turbines. And so it's not like people are going to fishermen saying, oh, if you could have this many turbines more spread out or this many more clustered together, how would you like to do that? So it's not a question that there's an easy answer to, and it's going to depend on the fishery and on the location and also on those cables, right? And where those are going to run and how much efficiency you're going to get on the amount of cables in the water. We did do an exercise with Equinor for their project in the New York Bight to look for a very limited number of turbines that had boundaries on it. They did sit down with fishermen and say, okay, if we could remove some of these locations by going to bigger turbines, where are the most important locations for fishing? That's a step in the right direction for sure. That's the only project that's actually done that so far. But I think it just depends. I think you need to look at an area and say, what's most important here to fishermen? Is it their operations? Is it transiting? Is it leaving enough open space around it? Is this a fishery that could operate if they were a mile or 2 miles or 4 miles apart? And do that really active and engaged co-planning with the fishing industry if you actually want to minimize impacts. But we don't. That's not the way we're doing it. And unfortunately, I think Joe kind of hit the nail on the head where it's looked at offshore that there aren't these kind of limitations about where to put them. You don't have these property rights, right? You don't have these. Yes, you have pipelines, UXO, and things you have to go around. But once you do that, fishing is looked at. Well, the fishermen can just move, or they can just work around it. And I think that's a really key problem we need to solve.
Great. We've just got a couple more minutes left, and this might be our last question. It's the longest one. Kevin Fitzwilliam of New Orleans is asking, my question is about the ability of the wind turbines in the Gulf of Mexico to be moved in advance of hurricanes. One of the graphics showed the European model of a single pole being drilled into the seafloor as a base, then a second model that was the jacket method, and a third model was a floating turbine. I would simply like to learn about how these floating turbines work, as in, does this already exist anywhere? How are they actually moved? I would imagine the carbon footprint of having some sort of tugboat, etc., moving these turbines would somewhat defeat the purpose of the windmills too. Sarah, do you know much about the floating design and how that would work?
Sure. Yeah. We're actually currently developing a floating concept, and that's pretty much the newest thing in the market. The main reason for that is we're simply running out of space for fixed foundations, and with the developments of Gulf of Mexico and West Coast, pretty much anything that's deeper than 200 feet or about 60 meter usually meets the requirement of floating. The floating concepts are still in very early stages of development, just in general around the world. There are a few pilot floating foundations currently in Europe. Scotland is actually, as Annie mentioned, it's pioneering one of the future floating farms. They, depending on the design, they're either rock anchored to the seabed, or they're tethered, similar to floating or spar or semi-submersibles. But the challenge is making sure that the structure can counteract or balance the extreme and very large load that's being placed on top of it due to the wind turbine. In terms of moving it, I've read that. I don't know the actual details of it, but it's usually they can pretty much unhook the actual tie downs or tethering, and either use a tugboat or towboat and bring them to safety. I don't know the actual, how much of a advance notice we would get if there is a hurricane of category 4 or 5. And if that would be possible to bring all the floating back. But I think generally for floating, there would be a combination of bring them either to safety or shutting the turbines down, which happen regardless, or having some high technology within the wind turbines that can maybe like flip the blades in and reduce the impact due to extreme wind speeds. But that's, as I said, still in early development phases.
And Joe, what do you think about the logistics of doing that, of moving an entire wind farm with boats?
A lot of good engineers tell me with enough time and enough money, anything could be engineered. But I see it as very very challenging and ambitious to have a wind farm of I'm going to just say 50 floating turbines, and Mother Nature sending a hurricane, and then you go about not only are you uncoupling all of the anchors, but you need to uncouple the electrical connections that are there as well. And whether or not you could have super tugs that hook up multiples and pull them all in a line, I don't know, but it would be a very lucrative gig for Gulf of Mexico tugboat market. I can tell you that.
Well, great, guys. Thank you very much. We've got it right to the hour mark, perfectly timed. And I want to thank you all very much, Annie and Sarah and Joe. I really appreciate you guys taking the time and talking to us about this. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Tristan, for
having
doing a
us.
good article.
See you
Thanks,
guys.
Tristan. Thank you. Bye.
You there, Tristan?
Can you hear me?
I can. Very nice. I think great information. The broadcast is ended, so, well, maybe we aren't. Yeah.